Hello, good evening. In some other place I go, you can sort of pick out patterns, but Slovene is completely opaque. For me, I've got no idea what just happened as I pick up some words. It's very nice for you to be here, really, especially the people that I've been seeing all day. You're amazing that you still have stamina to go through, so it's great. And also, if you've seen the film Groundhog Day, a couple of the slides might be repeated. You're not just getting too tired, it's intentional. This talk is a bit of a pair with Thursday's talk. This is more general about things that have happened that inform where things are going. And Thursday's is a case about a very specific project. So in a sense, preparation, theory, and then application on Thursday. It's sort of taster for you to come there. Let's see how this will go. I've got 45 to 50 minutes.
You see, if we are nodding off, you should stop.
Yeah, if I start seeing people nod off, then I'll do something else. Okay, there's a theme in all of this thing that we're going through, that type design reflects society, and it responds to how society changes, and also the type designers try to at least predict, if not, let's say, shift developments in a particular way. And I'm going to be talking about technology to a little bit, but mostly how technology influences the way we interact with documents and some other stuff. And I'm going to give you a framework, talk about 6 specific periods in which typography developed. And I'm going to cheat first of all by plopping a 0 in there. But stuff that were not really typography the way we see them, stuff that were one-offs, done individually by scribes, by copying other things. So they were extremely customized documents. They have echoes today in things like artist books, but in these cases they were documents that were supposed to be used, and they might be very informal documents like this, or they might be documents that might be more decorated if the pattern of the document might pay more money. But what is interesting to see here is that they had a very specific agenda. This is usually a sacred text. It might be sacred in a religious sense, or sacred in the classical Greek text, that it's Aristotle, which is equally sacred for some other people. It's done for a very specific reader who might have specified the amount of effort that would go into this, and there's one of these things. It's hugely expensive and it takes a lot of effort. And for our point of view, it doesn't look a lot like the books we're used to seeing, because there's just one and the text is very familiar. A lot of the navigation that we're used to seeing is not there. So color is used quite a lot. There aren't a lot of breaks. Space is used in a very different way than we'd expect. There are not many different styles of, we say, lettering in this case, other than initials. And there's a lot of decoration between the lines. It's a very different visual language. And what we see is that these things have quite a lot of complexities. This is a very typical working document where you have a standard text and all around it annotations. Now, hopefully people's notebooks look like this, because you read things, then you have other thoughts and so on. But these documents, you will see, will not have specific page numbers, they will not have sections, they do not have references to other parts of them, and they certainly do not have references to other books. Now, this is one of these things where for us, it's really difficult to imagine being in an environment where each text exists only once. We are really conditioned to think of things being repeatable. And the foundations for our way of thinking are bits like this. Now, the materiality of type is really important because it influences both the way you make things, but also the way you think about those things. It's convenient that things have 90-degree frames into which they sit, because then they can be modular and fit next to each other. And then all the technology that uses this as its basis extrapolates from these literal rectilinear bits. So you might see something that is text like this, and to make it you need to deconstruct everything into a little bit of squares. Now you might think, why am I seeing this? Well, you're seeing this because the language we've used to describe this persists to this day, and we might be talking about leading, and we might be talking about kerning, and we might be talking about thin and thick spaces. Language that came out of this technology that survives and jumps across technologies. And language is quite important because it frames the way you think about stuff. It also frames the limitations of what you can see, and you might see that there's some italic letters that skim a little bit over the edge, and we'll call this kerning, and the extent to which little bits of metal can survive being typeset next to other bits of metal and do this repeatedly determines the design of these bits. So you will only do things to the degree that it's efficient for you to do them. Therefore, the design language of the shapes responds to the limitations of the materials. And it will also respond to the environment of making. Now, increasingly as I get older, I realize that I'm speaking with people who have gone through school with computers in front of them. And there's a very big shift. In education, we noticed a big shift from the moment we saw students coming through, and from year one they were sitting in front of computers. Because they lost the sense of the materiality of letters. There weren't that many people doing work for school on a typewriter at home. The idea of things that are separate from the material that represents them was really pervasive. Whereas in this case, the material that you have at your disposal is fixed. You can only typeset so many pages before you run out of A's or B's or C's. And the guy who knows where the little bits are is a closed system. He is a specific professional who might belong to a union and has certain conditions for his employment and so on. So there's a whole system of production around specific documents. We see only the pages with the black ink on, but to forget that there's a very big economy and production system around it is remiss. So when we see documents like this, and comparing it with the earlier manuscript that we saw, the loss of color that we see from there to here is a direct result of the difficulties with which you can actually print something in color. So you see use of space and alternate styles and an elaboration in the typography simply because it is more efficient to do this if you're only printing in one color. What is something also important that we don't have anymore is the concept of the wear and tear of the primary materials. Because these little bits of metal get worn every time you ink them because there's a rubber thing, so there's a leather thing rubbing against them, and you're pushing them down with a press, and then you're throwing them back in the type case and they break off or they wear. So you get things like this, and that A there has clearly lost a lot of its counter, but you're thinking, I can still read it. So you see a lot of lessons about what are the essential bits that you need to have in a letter before they lose the capacity to tell you I am an A or a B or a C. This is a completely different world from our idea of extreme precision and control, where the limits of resolution are higher than the limits of our eyes to see. Yeah, we can make things, we can zoom in much more than we could really effectively see. We also see an interesting dialogue between society and invention, especially in the Enlightenment. This is sort of halfway through this period where people explore different tools, different ideas about the role of man in nature and where truth comes from are reflected into type. So the idea that you can construct things rationally takes place, and we have some interesting examples that are from the end of the 17th century, in this case France, which show you type design as something that is now not a craft object, but something that is done by a specific designer, someone who specifies shapes. In this case, a committee of designers that specify a set of shapes that need to be translated into metal by another group of practitioners who might be technicians. So you see a division of labor there. In this case, this is an interesting project also because of the elements of futility in it. Because if you think that these letters have to be about 12 points high, then the resolution that this grid represents is below the limit that it's possible to control your file and your graver when you are cutting bits of metal. You also see the problem that if you really cut bits of metal that were so thin as these, they would break off at the first instance. You could actually barely cast them. So in this project, you have a very interesting disconnect between the people who specify shapes and the people who make the shapes. This is the experience of a graphic designer today specifying a combination of inks that will not print on a specific paper, and the press operator really throwing up his hands in anger and saying, these designers don't know anything about press, they don't know what to specify. And some people are sort of smiling quite because I think they know what I'm talking about. Now, this idea of programmatic typefaces did not die then. This is Jan van Krimpen's Romulus that had a similar approach, that the idea of the two styles is connected in a programmatic way. This is Quark Express, or in design, slanting your uprights. This is coming straight from Morrison, having a theory about how typeface design should develop. But throughout this period, we have individual bits of metal. For every little bit of letter that you have an ink representing on paper, there was a separate bit of metal that somebody had to typeset. But from the beginning of the 19th century onwards, things changed drastically. And the 19th century is defined by the taming of metallurgy, essentially. The ability to make iron presses that have much more strength and allow you to print larger areas of paper. The idea that you have urban populations that have a higher demand for documents, and therefore you're competing for their attention. And this is a representation of a street 19th century London. Now, a lot of the ideas we have about our society are essentially 19th century ideas. Ideas of different classes of professionals doing things, and people are making and people are consuming. And this demand for attention of readers, they're all things that originate in the 19th century, when you needed to shout from the streets, essentially, and get people in to buy your tickets for auctions or go to your theater and so on. And for the first time, you have this pressure on type to attract readers. And as you get readership growing, you have more and more people being potential readers, you're trying to see competition in the documents themselves. Instead of being the domain of a relatively smaller educated elite, you have documents that are competing for a wide audience. And they start shouting. So you have very bold typefaces. You have things that have variations in style. And you have, for many decades, a lot of very different styles together. Now, for us now, this is very 19th century, because it says lots of different styles and they're all thrown together. Yeah? So we can detect the variety, we detect the absence of coordination, which is something later. We also see things like this, very pedestrian documents, the beginning of documentation. Again, the idea that there are documents that describe why things happen and how do they happen and what are the specifications for something is a uniquely 19th century thing. Because we begin to have people who want to organize things and typeset stuff. Because newspapers are in demand, and you cannot really typeset newspapers one letter at a time, so you have lots of people typesetting, and then you need to print faster, so you need some sort of rotary system that would feed lots of paper. A lot of invention, hugely uprooting conventions for printing. And towards the end of the 19th century, we have things like this. Now, this is one half of a monotype system. You get someone keying in, type there, make is important. And then there's a little paper tape that he's holding, which you take and you stick in the center of the machine there, which could be somewhere else. And the paper tape is like those automatic pianos. It gives you coordinates for a piece of machinery that holds matrices. The machine melts lead down and casts new type on the fly. So every time you produce it, it spits out little bits of metal, fresh bits of metal. Now, it's interesting that this is a guy sitting there, because printing has traditionally been a profession dominated by very strong unions with men. And this will come back to this. But if you have a machine like this, it's separate from the machine that is really heavy. Yeah, it casts a lot of metal. This could be anywhere. This could be on the first floor of your building. It doesn't need to be down in the basement where the heavy machinery is. And this looks a lot like a keyboard of a typewriter, which of course means that then you can hire cheap labor. Yeah? Cheap labor in 19th century, early 20th means women. Yeah? And if you look at all the advertising for these new technologies, it's always showing young women. Yeah? Now this is code to the employer and says, these are non-unionized workers. Yeah? Means they have lower labor costs and you can fire them. Yeah? And this goes on for decades. So it's a very interesting division, but it also means that those women are office workers. They wear clean clothes and they're on the floor above. Whereas the guys on the basement, they wear the overalls and they get their hands dirty. So you begin to see this division between different classes of professionals. What you also see is things like this. Now this is something completely new, a very 19th century idea. Before, the operator of the press can see how the thing is made. It's a wooden press or even it's an iron press. You can actually see a very simple machinery and understand exactly everything about it. These machines begin to push the technology right to the limit of what it is possible for the operator to understand. Now this is a case that is, the easiest parallel for this is your car, if you have, or a motorcycle. 25 years ago when I had my first motorcycle, I could actually service it myself. I could just take it apart and fix it. Now I have to go to the garage and the motorcycle has a computer in, the guy sort of plugs something in, and the motorcycle talks to the computer at the garage and tells it, I need new oil or something. So the technology is now hidden from me. Now this is a similar pattern that's going on there. So the operator of the technology is right at the limit of what it is possible to understand. So you can see perhaps how things work, but actually making them or repairing is already outside the bounds of the operator. And very quickly it will change. It also means that another professional class is beginning to take part. These are engineers for metallurgy. And type making becomes an engineering profession. So then you have draftspersons. Again, the signatures often have women who we don't know much about because they were hired as draftspersons, office persons, who are making drawings, engineering drawings, that an engineer would know how to then convert into patterns for type making. And there is a very interesting hidden story there, because what we would consider a designer would produce an abstract model, something that is drawn on a sheet of paper, out of which then an army of draftspersons and engineers would translate it into all the patterns for the different sizes that they needed to make type. So I'm going to close this section echoing something that Eric Hobsbawm, a historian, said. He talked about the 19th century as being a long period from the French Revolution to the First World War. Well, for type, we have a longer period from just before the beginning of the 19th century, when we begin to have the Industrial Revolution beginning, all the way to the end of the Second World War and the early post-war years, before phototypesetting really begins to develop. So in a sense, hot metal, which dominated most of the 20th century, is an extremely efficient Victorian technology that we keep using and using and using. And only after the 50s, when we begin to see electronics and photoelectronics taking part, do we really migrate into something that we recognize as modern. And the first cases are things like this. This is a matrix that, if you look closely, it has little bits of glass that letters are etched through it. So you have to shine light through it, and then with a series of mirrors directed onto photographic paper, which is a very 20th century thing, and then you expose it. And then very quickly you have to take this further. So you have another class of engineers that come in, and type design becomes something that is really abstracted and separated, because optics have a very interesting feature that you can distort the image, so you can scale it, and you don't have this connection anymore between individual drawings and things that are made, but you have this mutability of the shape. You can scale it and just design one, and then use it many times for different sizes. You can also scale it in also different ways. Now, what is very interesting is to see that type designers very early started seeing that this thing is going to change stuff. This new technology is going to really change things quickly. I'm not a fan of quoting Zapf, but he was very prescient in picking up that all of these new technologies bring new professional classes in, and he describes as the electronic technician. I think people would not really describe themselves as electronic technicians. They would say now that I'm an electronic engineer or a software engineer, and they would argue that their role is more important than the designer. But this is another class that speaks a different language, and it's a language that is informed by scientific rigor, because its expression is rigorous and precise. The conventions, however, are still the same as this. So the letters are being defined now in virtual little rectangles, but still in rectangles. and even your page layout applications right now have an invisible boundary for letters that they grab from the corner and move around. And perhaps they can overlay them, but they are still grabbing invisible little rectangles. And we move on to things that are getting a little bit more interesting. Fairly late, this is mid-80s, with the introduction of the Macintosh, and at the same time, within a year, Photographer, which allows digital expressions of typefaces, which existed for almost 10 years, to move across different technologies. Now this is one of the big changes, and we're really coming into modernity right now. Because up to that point, up to the mid-80s, we did have digital typefaces, but they were tied to a specific machine. It's like me buying my laptop and having typefaces I bought for this laptop, and when I have to buy another laptop, I have to buy all the typefaces again, because there are different formats for my next model. Okay? And suddenly all of this is out the window, and a whole industry of heavy type manufacturers collapses, because suddenly you can put your fonts on a floppy and take them from one place to the next. They're not necessarily better, but they're actually much more flexible, and they allow people to express what they're doing. And together with this industry change, which is extremely rapid, what we have is role changes. And we have people who had careers as engineers, as type designers employed by companies, overnight changing and having to set up small companies. So we go from Mick, who got trained as a linotype compositor and had a 40-year career in the print industry, to people like this, which shows that as long as you wear black, you can be a type designer. It's also interesting that it's an old photo, okay, yeah, but these are all really nice people. Yeah. And it's interesting that the moment you move away from these conditions that have no labor unions, they don't have these conventional, traditional structures of employment, you have a lot of boundaries breaking down. At first instance, you have the gender boundary. Yeah? And I was actually looking it up recently for some audit, and on the MA program, we have 55% male, 45% female graduates over the 12, 13 years. Yeah? But within the year, this was a slight bias towards guys. But through the years, there is no pattern. So some years have more women, some years have more men, and it sort of goes. So there isn't a specific balance. But very quickly we saw that it corrected a lot of the stuff that in the previous industry was very male-dominated. It also meant that a lot of geographical boundaries fell away, because the technologies were very, let's say, northwestern-centric, very big, heavy industries. It is difficult for people today to understand the kind of monopoly that companies like Monotype or Linotype had. Microsoft or Google cannot even dream of having the control and communication that Monotype had. There was not a single word in a book or a newspaper that was not typeset in one of these two technologies. Anything else was just copies of these technologies that was done secretly. And to give you the idea of how efficient these technologies were, during the Soviet times, the Russians would buy Monotype machines secretly, break them apart, and make copies of them. Yeah? They were such efficient machines that they were essentially, it was cheaper and easier to copy the existing machines rather than to try to make something new from scratch. All that gets washed away. Now, unfortunately, it really got washed away because these were really big, heavy machines that would melt lead, and it's not a very health and safety thing to have molten lead in a work environment. So a lot of them just went for scrap metal. A few years later, people realized that these are really interesting machines. They tell you a lot of very interesting stories about how people used to think about documents and work relationships and so on. And we're now seeing people trying to salvage any that are left. And indeed, they are much more rare and valuable than old letterpresses. So if there's any around, they're worth looking at things. But what is beginning to change, together with this shift onto computers, is this idea of connectedness. And again, people my age would remember this transition very clearly, that we would be born into small villages, essentially. Even what we felt of was a big city was a village, because Anything outside it, you had to communicate face-to-face with people and drive there, walk there, whatever. And within our lifetime, we saw all of these borders falling away, and people then being just a phone call away, or an email away, or a text away. And increasingly more and more, this is happening, and it liberates the way people are working. At its basis are two key technologies. One, Unicode, one OpenType. One describes the content of things, and the other describes the appearance of specific things. So a letter A might be encoded in a way that it will always be read as a letter A by any computer anywhere. And then OpenType allows you to style that thing in a specific way and add behaviors to it. And I'm not going to talk about Unicode too much. It's an essential framework for anything that informs human communication right now. But what is very interesting is that built in, the way we see things, is OpenType, which allows us to refine the appearance of things. Now, OpenType also allows you to deal with scripts that might have complex features. In this case, Arabic, which is a joint script that has different forms of letters for initial, medial, and final, and might have a lot of context-sensitive substitutions. Now, this is something that 20 years ago would be extremely difficult to do without proprietary software and things customized to specific markets. Whereas now it's quite possible to have any browser looking at competently rendered complex scripts. What we also see is changes in how documents are published. Now, this looks very familiar to anyone. It's a simple blog structure. What it has, however, is a very flat hierarchy. It's a very simple document. For a designer, this is a series of headings, text, headings, text, headings, text. So there isn't a lot of typographic variation there. But what we see growing is a complexity on this level. So we begin to see things like this. Now, this is very interesting development because especially newspapers push the limits of what it is possible to do within the field of vision. And if you think of a broadsheet newspaper, you would have an environment where you have possibly 8 different entry points into the spread. As you get smaller newspapers into Berliners or tabloids, you might go down to 5 points and so on, but then you're really running into limits of how much stuff can you cram in. And you move it to the size of what is sort of an oversized A5, A4, a bit. You really are running out of options. So this idea of complex navigations in documents being able to be represented efficiently for documents that people are not meant to spend too much time thinking about is actually quite critical. There's different ways in which people do this, but tablets are very important because there is a huge economic motivation to shift a lot of industries in them. And one of the biggest drivers is education. At the moment, depending on standards in each country, there is the school books might be printed privately, or they might be printed by the state or the local authority and owned by the school. Now, this means a huge investment in text that have to survive for 3 or 4 years and pass on from one student to the next. They can also not be messed up by children, which is a big if you ask me, because they need to be used both for learning and also for the tests. And then they need to be used cleanly again for the next year. Whereas if you shift textbooks for education onto tablets, for which the cost is coming really down, then it means that you can have annually updated text for education that can be used for assessment and feedback and learning at the same time, with control by the teachers. And they end up being cheaper for the state, essentially. Yeah? It's easier to get the parents to buy their kids one tablet that they will use for a few years, rather than for the state to print all the books that the children will have to use. So there's interesting discussions there. But this is a very big driver, getting complex text hierarchies on this. At the same time, we're seeing a reversal of a lot of assumptions. What used to be permanent would be in print, whereas now what we see is a very quick abandonment of print for the sake of things that are permanently online, especially things with reference works, dictionaries, encyclopedias. They tend to move online because they run out of date very quickly when they're in print, but also because our idea of a document is changing. We're thinking of documents now as interconnected things. If you look at how you read now in consumer information, you might assume that you're going to find a reference to something in your first article that you read, and then you're going to follow this up or to another search. Or if you're reading something in print, the thing can barely send you to another part of the object itself rather than something else. So this is really thinking again about how we are considering things. There's a very interesting discussion about permanence and about preservation and what is archival grade anything. But I think what we're seeing is that a lot of the market is voting with its feet. And when you see people like Britannica saying, we're done with the print editions, or on Thursday I'll show you a dictionary, people say, it's not worth it investing in paper dictionaries anymore because people do not buy enough of them fast enough. And increasingly we see solutions for people to migrate documents online. Now you might have something like this, which looks like some sort of online storage of probably some sort of boring business document. Yeah? Now there's interesting questions that something like this raises, and the first one is, why is this thing looking like a collection of pages? Where did the idea of the page come from? It came from actually having to make sheets of paper that we would fold down and then print in a specific print environment. You know, this thing is, in a sense, an infinite canvas. Is there a better way of doing this? And we see how a lot of conventions that have to do with the language again survive. So, what was this? This is a magazine, right? You look at your magazine and you hold it and it tells you things about itself before you start reading it. From the way it feels in your hands, how slippery or rough the paper is, how reflective it is, the quality of the thickness of the paper, and also you can see how much time it demands because you can see how thick it is immediately. So you can get some idea of what's going on. And you have a lot of conventions to rely on. You know that if you're looking at a fashion magazine, there's going to be about 20 pages of ads, then another 10 pages of news and snippets, and then 40 pages of fashion reporting, and then so on. You already know this, so you can navigate the document before you open it. But if there's an electronic document, the structure of the document is something like this. Things do not have pages that are imposed on you, they are just endless streams of text that end when the content ends, and they might be in sequence. The problem is that they don't really like this, they look something like this. You cannot tell how big one article is from the next, they just look identical, whether it's a simple paragraph or it is several pages. And what you have is the problem at the top of the hierarchy, in a sense, the contents list of the document. What is there in this thing that I'm holding? So I pick up something that is on a tablet, and the tablet doesn't know very much about what it is, it's an agnostic device. So I have to have the typography explain itself to me. Yeah? It has to do much more than a print typography has to do. And if we think of a single article, our idea of the article has changed because it might have links in it. It might say, oh, Slovenia, go and read this report about this traveler who went to Slovenia and posted on TripAdvisor. Yeah? And then there might be comments that you want to make there, and then some other people posted comments on this and say, oh, actually no, I had a really nice experience when I went to that restaurant, and look at that stuff. So you have 4 different levels of things that happen in a document. You have the author or reader making links and annotations, and then you have others who are also making links and annotations to a document. So the document becomes a hub, to a network of connections that somehow need to explain themselves. And the typography needs to do this. So you might have things like this, that are trying to make sense of very large bodies of information. And this is something that is new for designers now, because until very recently we did not have the idea of bodies of information that are just simply too large for human memory to deal with. In the last few years, the government in Britain has decreed that all information produced by the government should be public unless there is a reason for it not to, which is the opposite that of what used to happen, which was we don't need to tell you anything unless they resume to tell you something. But now if you get even my local authority publishing all the public accounts and the minutes of all their meetings and every contract with any contractor that picks up the garbage and so on online, there's just too much stuff for anybody to deal with. So you begin to have these fake documents. They're not really documents. These things are collections of connections that are generated for specific users, specific readers at specific times with specific intentions only. So this might be something that says, for this specific thing that you want to see in the government's activity in your area, these are the relevant documents and so on, relevant bits of information. And it's interesting here that this is a proper government portal, but they're also integrating social network commenting for the document itself. So it's an interestingly solipsistic affair where the document comments on itself as it happens. Yeah? And you have things like this. Huffington Post is another one. Things that do not exist in any real sense anywhere other than because they're collections of stuff. So the curatorship, in a sense, the way you collect things becomes the editorial process of the document, which is something much less explicit than you would have in a magazine or a newspaper. Yeah? And in this case, you're also mixing very different roles. You might have people who are writing for free and people who are writing for payment. And very interestingly, very well established publications are thinking of going all digital because where's the money? Yeah? Interestingly, even mainline newspapers that we think are viable online are often not viable as enterprises. And in this case, the Guardian rushed to disprove the rumor that they are actually abandoning print. But this is something that we know is coming. Now, the moment you abandon the connection between the conventions of print and the way they are applied online, what you begin to have is a similar revolution to the one we had when we went platform independent with fonts. We have something that says, these conventions that define the way you think about yourself don't apply anymore. So the idea that a newspaper is something that has something for everyone doesn't need to be there anymore. Do I need to get the sports bit of this? Because it doesn't need to be just one edition of a newspaper. Yeah? Whereas the old idea of a newspaper, it has a car insert and a fashion insert and a sports insert and this and that, because you need to do everything for everyone. You get a little bit of something for every reader. The moment you abandon that stuff, you lose a lot of the fixities of what the document is. And you have things like this. This is Instapaper. This is a personal aggregator. So as you traverse the internet through your daily life, you might collect links to things that you don't have time to read, or you subscribe to specific commentators or publications. And these can come together automatically, and they curate your own, by themselves, your own edition of a newspaper. So if I want to read a lot about European politics, I can, while reading nothing about European sports, about which I couldn't care less. And that is now possible to do. So I define my own little publication. And of course, who pays for this thing is an interesting topic. Now, it looks on many levels like we have abandoned completely a lot of the conventions, but if we look at older documents, the basic typography is not much different from what we see now. Interlinear spacing, type sizes, the proportion of typefaces themselves is not too different. Here, this is Didot, this is Emigre. The font might be completely different and it looks super wacky, but the way the text is typeset is actually perfectly respectful of conventions about spacing, because I'm pretty sure that Laurie Haycock McKellar cared about people reading her words. So there's only so much that you can push some stuff before people rebel and abandon it. There's interesting discussions about how do you read and how the device influences how you read. This is typical of a viewpoint that looks primarily on the technology. And this is something that faces us as the texts themselves become more and more disembodied. that we tend to talk about things through the technology that is used to implement them. So people who want to learn typeface design might think that it is about using the applications through which you make fonts, rather than learning how to make the decisions on these technologies. And the great thing is this customization, this embodiment. This is one of the most interesting recent projects where you have something that exists as a newspaper but specifically online. It has no print counterpart, very intentionally, but it is designed to operate in all the different formats that people would read it. Now, what we have here is the content complexity of a newspaper, but actually having to operate on very different environments. So how do you get that stuff? Because you might have navigation on a document level, and you might have some sort of article listing, and you might have then within the article different kinds of text. In this case, they're using color for links and so on. But we see that the typography is really beginning to be pushed to its limits with this. And you might have specific platforms that allow you to do more or less. Now, what is a given is that any content will need to be published in environments like this that are flexible, that are responsive to the ways in which people access the texts, and that they conform to the way that people read. Because you might be catching up on your news here while you're waiting for the lecture to start, or you're sitting in a bus and you're catching up on news there, instead of having an hour in the evening to sit in front of the fireplace and read the newspaper. Yeah? I'm sure somebody does this stuff. Now, typefaces. To close the loop and see how typefaces come back and reflect their time. Not long ago, all we knew was things like Times. A typeface that had quite a long history and became very important because it was one of the first typefaces that with Windows 3.1 was customized so that it would render well enough on screen. And when we say on screen, we don't mean things like this, we mean the old CRT screens that were about this big. And in the mid-90s, Microsoft realized that the internet was a place where the market would grow and money was to be made. And they pump-primed Georgia, which was a bit chunkier and better developed so that it would fit on the pixels. Still a low-resolution screen by our standards today, and would have a relatively wide open italic that when you italicize it on screen would still render okay. And we went from things like Arial, which has its verticals very close together and it has some clunky curves, to things like Verdana, which still looks clunky when you print it out, but you never intended to print it out, but it's very well spaced, so it will always keep wide columns of space between the verticals. And it gets you to read a bit more on screen. And then when flat screens get cheaper, this is early part of the 20th century, people say, let's move people away from their printers and the desktop computers altogether because we want them to buy laptops. This is Microsoft's business plan. And by that time, flat screens mean that you have much better rendering technology for your screen. ClearType is Microsoft's version, Adobe has something called CoolType, and Apple has its own version. So they developed typefaces like Cambria and Calibri, which are now specifically developed to render well on screen and get you not printing out, so you can move with your laptop to your sofa and so on. Calibri, very interestingly, is a default typeface for Office, which means that people who are not designers are assumed to be comfortable enough reading a sans serif as a default typeface. That's a huge change from just a couple of decades in the back. And typefaces like Kandara, again shipping with Office, but a typeface that lays claim on quite a lot of attention through being a dominant typeface on people's systems, but has shed all the historical connections that you would expect of a mainstream typeface to have. It's since very self-absorbed, it just looks at itself and says, no straight curves anywhere. As we spend more and more time on screen, you expect the typefaces to respond to the condition in which we are making things. Scholar is a very extremely successful typeface right now, which was fantastically lucky because it hit the market right when web fonts started being, people started being aware of web fonts. It So one of the flagship typekit typefaces, it was the right typeface at the right time. A lot of people use it because it is fairly straightforward in its features. It doesn't have a lot of quirks, it's relatively open in its counters. It has these chunky slab serifs that allow it to render okay, and actually you need to print it out, but also on all sorts of screens. And its italic is similar. It is relatively open, it looks like a cleaned up, slanted upright. You can see that the inch strokes have fairly straight lines, so they can align on a grid of pixels. So it's a typeface that doesn't push the rendering environment very much. And it follows in a trend that was established a few years back, where people realized that actually we need something that will work okay in a range of environments. And TISA was the first one that I'm aware did this, and it's the owner of that genre. But you see typefaces like this that have a relatively uniform weight and width. It's low contrast typefaces with chunky slab serifs, with details that when you look at it big, it looks different than others. The important thing is that these types allow you to use a forgiving environment. So if you have a crappy inkjet at home, it will still look okay. And if you can print high resolution, it will look okay. Where people get carried away is with things like this. I'm not sure I will forgive you this. This idea that typefaces become products that need to fill certain boxes. And if you have a family that's successful, it needs to have a partner that's a serif, and a slab, and a cursive, and a display this, and a this, that. And typefaces become these monsters that are supposed to do everything for everyone. Now, if you're a good typographer, you're very unlikely to pair the sans of one family with the serif of the same family. You're probably going to choose typefaces from different families, so you have some control over the contrast. So there's interesting suppositions there that the people who market the typefaces make. But this expansion has interesting extensions into other environments, where what we see is typefaces extending also sideways into other scripts, and that is in a sense much more fundamental. Now in this case, Scholar is significant because very quickly it jumped into the Indian market and has Devanagari, it also has a Gujarati, and it's growing. So then you have a typeface that has competent typographic characteristics and also has the ability to cover scripts with the range of weights that typographers there need. And that is one of the changes where typefaces have reflected this globalization of documents. The problem is that things are too uniform and people still try to find this room for originality. This typeface, designed by Nicole Dottin 5 years ago, is trying to find a space for an elegant text typeface for screens. And it has a certain delicacy in its strokes that would not be very easy with screens of low resolution. It doesn't look very good if you have an iPhone 3. It looks brilliant if you've got an iPhone 4. It takes advantage of the resolution. So these ideas of low resolution typefaces or environments and high resolution rendering environment typefaces is very quickly falling apart. And then you have typefaces that are using a range of influences that were not possible before. A typeface that is using influences from Devanagari to design a Latin, or is a very self-consciously postmodern typeface. Now if you look at this, it looks like a brushstroke typeface, but it's an impossible brushstroke typeface because you would have to have a brush that sort of flips around while it's halfway through the stroke, and the bits that are in strokes do not correspond with the bits that are out strokes. And the shapes have details that change. So it's something that very self-consciously tries to trick you and say, oh, this looks like this, but in reality it's something else. And to top it off, you might have typefaces that very explicitly break with any historical convention. This is Jeremy Tankard's Finland, which looks a bit odd because it has the thicks and the thins in the wrong place. So the green one is formal, a typeface that is extremely conventional in its distribution of thicks and thins, and Fenlon is the blue one. And whereas the green one has a very predictable stress angle, the blue one is wildly drunk, if not on some sort of strange drugs, because especially when you have the S, you see that within a single curve, the stress flips 4 times. And that has to do with a very different idea about what a stroke is and what a corner is. In this case, Jeremy was looking at how tubes bend, or deform when you bend them, and they get thinner at the bit which bends most, which is something that is very alien for type. However, when you look at the two typefaces side by side, so it's formal at the top, Fenlon at the bottom, and I've only adjusted the size so that they run on the same length, you will see that the spacing is not very different. The underlying pattern is very similar to those conventions that we're used to seeing. And those are actually very close to the earlier historical documents I showed you, the one with a very worn type. So what has survived across all of these technologies and across these different stylistic treatments is this underlying pattern of counter, stroke, counter, stroke, counter, stroke. And this gives you the bedrock onto which you build things. At the same time, our ideas of families changed, and this is Höfler and Ferrer-Jones' ideal sans, an extremely nicely detailed typeface that looks very effortless. And you also think, well, okay, but there are a lot of typefaces that can do similar things. And yeah, that's true. But what it does is it has a wide range of weights that are coordinated with the standard weights for CSS. Now, the way you describe appearance online uses, with the latest version of CSS, 9 different weights or styles, which give you a specification for a family. And if you start doing extra lights to ultra heavies, there you have 9 weights. Now, if you look at a lot of the typography work that people are doing for complex documents, that's actually pretty good. You're not too bad if you have a typeface family with 9 weights, which immediately sets a standard for the next person doing a typeface family that is intended to work with a wide range of weights. So 9 is okay. And you can see these distinctions beginning to work. Now, what we have at the moment, however, is this identification with languages suggests things that are linear progressions. So you might have styles encoded as 100, 200, 300, 400, which suggests that there is the same step between the different members of the family. Whereas a typographer thinks of sort of okay, slightly heavier than okay for inside the text, and then really much heavier if it's going to be a heading, and very different italic if it's a quote, but not very different if it's an emphasis thing. And you have a much more relative way of thinking about typefaces that has to do with the functionality in the texts. And at the moment we do not have this connection made very efficiently. And that is, since a bit of a problem also for typographers, not explaining to web designers what are the different kinds of categories of text. Fonts for academic publishers, fonts for news, and all sorts of screens. These things are where typefaces are really exploding right now. Now if you have this, you have the problem of having the different headings, and especially when you go in something small. The interface does not have space for images anymore. You cannot use images for navigation, there just isn't enough space. You need to have something that is typographically refined enough to tell you this is the beginning, this is the middle, this is the end, this is the heading and the subheading and the strapline. And this is where the most interesting growth in type happens right now. So when you look at typefaces that people are putting a lot of effort in developing, this is Tablet Gothic by Type Together, it has 42, I think, different styles. 40 is sort of crazy if you think as a type designer, what would you do with 42 different styles in a typeface? But the document designer doesn't need 42, they need 6 or 7, but they need those specific 6 or 7 depending on the kind of document that they're designing. So you can envisage people cherry picking different combinations of things to fit a specific document. Of course, this becomes quite big for one person to do over a few evenings. And what we see is that, whereas we went through this idea that typeface design is not anymore a unionized industrial profession, and it might be something that individual people can do, it's now moved on to something different, where it is almost exclusively a collaborative enterprise. If you're doing something that's just display retail typefaces, you might do it on your own, but in most cases it is something that you need a lot of people in it, because the projects that will actually pay you enough money to pay your rent and your school, the school for your kids and so on, are the ones that have 42 weights, and in regulars and italics, and they also might then have the Cyrillic and the Greek and the Hebrew and so on for them. And these are things that really require big teams behind them. So the typeface designer becomes a very collaborative profession that requires people to work very well by understanding how others think about design. Because you might get to do the light and the regular, and somebody else who is in a different country might do the bold and the semi-bold and so on. So I'll round things over, because I've gone through quite a lot of stuff. I'm just a few minutes over. We have a growing out of very specific historical models. We are much more free in how we see things that have come to us through tradition, and people are much more free in developing new styles. This happens side by side with an extension of typefaces into both wide families but also deep coverage of scripts globally. And we are thinking much more flexibly about specific sizes, simply because the devices in which people operate now allow the user to customize things and zoom in. We see that typography becomes more and more important in anything that has to do with identities that are rendered softly. You're buying your mobile phone contract or your service contract for anything, there might not be anything printed that you have to access. Everything is soft, and it's on a screen, and it might be a small screen, so you don't have enough space to see that this is Vodafone or The Guardian or this or that magazine that I'm subscribing to. And it's only the typeface and a certain combination of colors that allows you to differentiate. But at the level of the typography, of the paragraph, the typography survives. That is where a lot of the lessons over the past 500 years are still extremely valid and actually have a lot to teach the people who are working online. And the industry is changing again. What we see is this globalization. We see a lot of growth in what used to be satellite regions. So we now have a lot of people who might be native Indian designers developing typefaces for India, which 30 years ago would never happen. You would have people developing that stuff in the West and then exporting it, and perhaps it would be adapted there. You have a lot of growth in places like Southeast Asia. Younger people who are developing careers as typeface designers, but not so that they will work in London or New York, but so that they will go on working in Kuala Lumpur or Seoul. And what we have is this idea of branding growing. This is an interesting project for the Dutch government. The Dutch tend to be a bit more aware of things like this. Now, the problem of a government is that they collect all your taxes and they want to tell you that they're spending them well. And essentially what this does is it allows the Dutch government to brand everything that is paid for with tax revenue. So if actually the post van is a Dutch government van, it is branded with the typeface and the style of the Dutch government. So there's this reinforcement that this thing is paid by you, the citizens, rather than just something that looks like some contractor stuff. So it's actually a very interesting idea that services are branded, and things that are quite intangible, like civic, let's say, keeping clean the city is something that has a brand that carries it. And increasingly brand commons are very much aware of these things and how they're losing this connection with specific perhaps products and services that have to be branded. At the same time, things are moving online very, very quickly. Typecast is a very interesting online platform for specifying typography for documents. And it's a very short step from something that is developed for styling blogs and online magazines to something that can then also spit out CSS that is capable for print. So then you abandon having your expensive InDesign license on your heavy laptop that needs to have a processor heavy enough to run that thing locally, and you might have a server-based page layout application that designs documents, one of which instance is something printed. And in the type industry you have something similar. You don't have the need to have typefaces anymore on your desktop, which, apart from they think they're mine and I have them, has the problem that mine might be slightly different than yours. And if you think that this is uncommon, it's extremely common. Even staples like Adobe fonts have versions, and they fix bugs from version to version and change things. So some characters might change, or some widths might change. And the service provider who is going to rip your document might not have the same versions as you. So if you have a centrally cloud-based version of your font that you are communicating with, it shifts your connection to resources to something even more dematerialized than the shift from hot metal to phototypesetting in the digital day. It also means that your relationship with the font publisher is quite different, because you're treating fonts the same way you would be treating music. You might have an iFonts thing, hosted perhaps by Adobe, where you go and you buy a license with a micropayment the way you buy a song from iTunes. Or in this case, you might rent a font just for a project, and then you're done with it and you don't want to buy the whole of it. So there's all these very interesting new business models. So, where do we go from here? Because a lot of that stuff is, whoa, it's a bit overwhelming, and there's huge things happening, and all these different industries in flux and changing, and where are we going? Because I've still got 30 years before I retire. I think typography is at the core of everything. What we see is that the one thing that is at the hub of everything that has to do with communication with texts is a good understanding of how typography gives meaning to texts. So how do you structure information, how do you give sequence, condition, coherence to texts? And it is actually fairly straightforward. The kind of information that you have to communicate in a different environment is not very different from the information you had to communicate before. The volume is, and the filtering might be different, but the basics of reading and interacting with documents are fairly similar and consistent. And you have a lot of change at the level of the navigation between documents and how things are organized, but not within the document itself. And the most important factor in all of this is the reader. Again, this idea of being able to put yourself in the position of the reader and understand what is it that they are expecting from the document and how they're responding to it. You're always prescribed in what choices you have by the technology that you have at your disposal, which tends to change. So, in a sense, it is a fickle mistress, because you have to keep the technology happy and get her to do what you want with the document, but you know that she will change her mind, and what is a restriction today will be possible tomorrow, and then something else happens, there's another set of restrictions on, and so on. And at the end of it, there is always a business. There's a very strong creative element in what we do, but at the end of the day, there is a business. And the person buying the newspaper or buying the subscription to the newspaper really just wants to get the news. And the more efficient you are in getting them the kind of news they want, when they want it, in the easiest possible way, the more likely they are to renew the subscription. So the amount of effort that you're putting into making something beautiful to look at, and interesting and efficient and functional, is something that people will not see. They will continue not understanding the added value of design, and it will be still a task to explain to clients what this is. The way to get out of this is to have an informed view about all of that stuff, not to see design as something only that operates on a surface layer, but engages with all of the stuff that we talked about, the history of document making and the history of giving form to meaning and engaging with readers, and then have a view about how design changes and how you respond to all of the stuff that is happening around you, so you can then contribute in turn to all of this process. And I'll stop, because I think I've given people enough to think about. Thank you. Any questions or expressions of I'm in the wrong career? This is something that is the case, because the way people my generation learned how to do things was not very different from the way the people who taught me learned themselves. Yeah? Whereas within the first 20 years of my career, things got completely transformed. A lot of the skills that we got trained to have were just thrown out the window. Yeah? On the other hand, a lot of things became easier and more exciting, and what is much more interesting, and I think keeps people in my generation constantly happy, is this idea that so much more stuff is possible. It might still have its own problems, but actually you can bring interesting ideas that have to do with communication in front of people's eyes. There's a very interesting challenge there. There's much more competition, because you're competing with people from everywhere, and there's a lot of good people everywhere. So it's a steeper hill to climb, but the view from the top is really nice. Okay.
Do you have any ideas where things are going to go in the next 20 or 30 years? If they're going with a...
If I had, I would be a really rich man now. And I wouldn't be here, I would be sitting in the coffee shops just cashing in. I think one of the characteristics of the last, say, 10-15 years is that enough smart people are working with enough intensity in so many places around the world that interesting ideas are happening at a rate that's really difficult for us to see where they're going. Yeah? And some of these things might appear dead ends or futile, and something might be obvious. So the moment you saw an iPhone, you thought, duh, it makes sense. Yeah? And very quickly we see that a 3-year-old can figure it out, and it's not a big step to see that, oh, documents would migrate there. And I might think that this stupid Google Glass thing is going to be a dead end, because I think it's social suicide, and if someone came up to me with this, I would want to punch them in the face. Because I really don't want to be filmed without me knowing. And that might mean, not that the product is not a good idea, but that means that I'm getting old. Yeah? And the same way, perhaps there's a difference in how people today see the way young people post all their lives online. The same thing will happen now, a generation later, and my children will not think at all that there will be a live stream of everything they see somewhere online forever. And it's a matter of perception. So I don't think we can figure out where we're going. I do know that the visual representation of information is not going away. We have more and more information, we have more and more reading. We don't necessarily have the same kind of reading, so people might be reading fewer single long texts. But that might mean not that they're getting worse at reading long texts, it means that they're getting more impatient with bad authors. And they have a thirst for a certain quality or kinds of text that were not accessible before. So I might be reading more political commentary online, because that gives me something that a single book might not give me. Yeah? Not because I'm too impatient with a book. And I think what survives in both is that you have a text that somebody needs to design around, and somebody needs to present to your reader in a way that they can make sense of it. And that doesn't go away. So the core skills of typography, I think, are going to survive in the next 20 years. Oh yeah. Yeah.
This might be a very stupid question.
My answer might be stupid. The
It's
question
not a
will
very
not. No.
technical question. since we are the fonts of the typefaces are migrating into clouds.
Hmm.
If we can see
That's my prediction, but that's not 20 years. That's
that's
services that are out
already
there
going on
that,
the way.
for me, it's obvious that is going to happen. And in that, I would be willing to wager that that stuff will all go online.
And if we consider typography as something that is the base of our documents,
Hmm.
the whole foundation, are we sort of going into an area where our documents, the things that we create, are something that might sort of disintegrate if, for example, a publisher of a typeface decides to discontinue support
Okay.
for font?
The content will never disappear because the typeface goes out of circulation, because everything is encoded through Unicode in a way that is, in a sense, indifferent to its appearance. Yeah? And that survives as long as you have that stored somewhere. It is, of course, interesting to say, how long will people keep paying the electricity bill for that server onto which the archive of the newspapers that you want to access is? Yeah? So I think there are questions that we have not solved, simply because we're just beginning to come out of being primitive beings. Yeah? I mean, I think in 5,000 years people will see this moment right now, the beginning of the maturity of humanity. This idea that we became aware that we're on a big planet. Yeah? And so your generation is the first one that is growing up in a world that is really aware of the rest of everybody who's there. Yeah? And the idea that there's news in Mongolia and North Korea, and now I feel odd because I haven't read the news and I don't know if the madman has launched anything. That for me is something that, 30 years ago was not part of my experience. It was just too far away for me to understand that it's happening. So I think this stuff matters, that we are connected and that our texts are connected some way. What is interesting for Slovenes to ask, which is similar to what Greeks should ask, is what happens with small, relatively inconsequential countries, because actually I can say this here because we're in the same boat, we're too small to matter, right? If you're Spain, there's half of South America that speaks, and most of the United States increasingly, that speaks Spanish, so you're okay. If you're Greece or Slovenia or the Netherlands for that matter, let alone Hungary, which is a really weird language that has no connection with anything, then the preservation of that language and the culture that goes with it is something that you need to think about explicitly. You cannot say, it's English, people will always read Shakespeare, it will survive. Yeah? You cannot do this with Slovenian, because in this sort of connected world, every child needs to know English, because most of the business transactions will be in English, and because you might be working quite a lot with people outside your country. So this idea that people will be functionally bilingual, and function means enough to do business, is actually something that is very clearly coming, because you do need these lingua francas. Now this means that a lot of the activity of language generation and culture generation happens in the common language, especially if it is international in nature. So then how do you preserve the documents that guard the difference of the other half of your identity? And that is an interesting problem that I think people are not paying enough attention to. Because you might say, what is Slovene culture in terms of documents, stuff that we need to store digitally? I don't know. And especially if you talk about culture that is generated on the fly, because literature is easy, right? It's specific things, discrete stuff that you can store. But what about the graffiti that kids do on the sides of trains? Is that something that needs preservation in some way? And how do you preserve this in a digital environment? And I think one of the victims of the current situation that all of Europe is in is that with the threat of this financial cliff that everybody faces, we've actually stopped thinking about a lot of other stuff that's important. So we're sacrificing, perhaps welfare payments to get through austerity, through whatever it is that we're going to get through, whenever we get through. But if this thing is about 10 years long, what will happen in those 10 years is that new business models and new ways of doing things with education and text and everything will be well embedded, because they are developed in bigger countries with better developed industries for producing these things. And then in 10 years' time, when Southern Europe collectively goes, now let's get on to business, they will be faced already with solutions developed by others that will not be really developed for small countries with questionable industries and with not a very long tradition of preserving things. Okay? That for me is a real threat of what is happening right now that nobody is talking about. So in terms of predictions, I cannot predict what will happen, but I'm very worried that we might see a lot of things getting lost. On this happy note. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.